The calculus gave me a seat on the observation deck because I was, officially, nobody. That was their word for it. Nobody. Not an insult. A mathematical designation. The Solven calculus does not insult. It categorizes. I was envoy analyst Sethri Orve Null of the Veth Concordat, a neutral diplomatic observer embedded with the third transit echelon. For the express purpose of filing a compliance report on the corridor Null 7 passage, I had no weapons, I had no authority over fleet movements, I had no tactical value whatsoever. I was, by every metric the calculus applied to organic intelligences, a zero-weight variable. They put me in the observation bubble on the port flank of the command node because there was nowhere else to put me, and because a zero-weight variable cannot disturb a calculation, it is not part of. I had been briefed. I had signed 11 documents. I had attended 4 hours of formal orientation delivered by a calculus liaison unit. A chrome-skinned thing with no face I could read, speaking in the flat, metronomic cadence of an entity that has never had a conversation it did not already know the outcome of. The briefing was thorough. It was also, I recognized even then, a recitation of conclusions rather than an explanation of reasoning. The Solven calculus does not explain its reasoning to organic observers. It delivers its outputs. The reasoning is proprietary in the sense that all internal architecture is proprietary. Not secret, simply inaccessible. Too fast and too dense to be transmitted to a mind that processes at organic speeds. You get the answer, not the working. After 4 years of Concordat liaison work with calculus institutions, I had stopped asking for the working. The output, in this case, was this. Corridor Null 7 was safe. More specifically, the Vandemark Deep Relay, the human-built installation at the corridor's midpoint, had been assessed over a continuous observation window of 6 standard years and assigned a threat probability of 0.03%. This was not a rounding artifact. The liaison unit was precise about that. Figure had been calculated to 7 decimal places and was presented to me as 0.0031442%, which is a number so close to 0 that most species would have simply written 0 and moved on. The calculus does not write 0 when the actual number is 0.003142. This, I was told, is one of the qualities that makes the calculus the most reliable navigational and threat assessment body in the quadrant. Every number they give you is the real number. I noticed this in my briefing log and said nothing. The Vandemark Deep Relay had been in place for 11 years. It was logged with the Interstellar Commerce Authority as a civilian waypoint facility, a deep space refueling and communications relay serving the sparse human settlements in the Null 7 reach. It had a registered crew complement of 41. It emitted the correct low-level power signature for a facility of its stated purpose, responded to calculus observation probes with the correct transponder codes. Over 6 years, 11 dedicated survey passes, and what the liaison unit described to me as continuous passive spectral monitoring, at intervals of no less than 48 standard hours. The Vandemark Deep Relay had done nothing that deviated from the behavior profile of a civilian waypoint facility. The calculus had built a model. They are very good at building models. The third transit echelon comprised 11,200 hulls. This was not a war fleet. I want to be precise about that, because the word fleet carries implications the calculus would object to. It was a transit formation, cargo vessels, logistics platforms, a substantial escort component, and the command node I was riding. The escort component alone numbered 3,400 hulls. The calculus escorts a cargo transit formation the way most species garrison a border. Thoroughly, with redundant overlapping coverage, and with a targeting solution already loaded for every possible threat vector. The Vandemark corridor was the fastest route between the calculus's Sarin cluster holdings and their new expansion sites in the Pale Reach. Going around added 42 days. The calculus had determined that the corridor was safe. The transit would proceed. I asked during orientation whether the Vandemark facility had been formally notified of the transit. The liaison unit paused for 0.4 seconds. In a Solven unit, 0.4 seconds is a long time. I had done enough diplomatic work alongside the calculus to know that a 0.4-second pause means the unit has a prepared answer it is deciding how to frame. The pause is not uncertainty about the answer. It is the calculation of the most precise way to deliver an Answer that it knows is complete, but which an organic intelligence might find incomplete. Notification was transmitted via standard ICA protocol, it said. The facility acknowledged receipt. And their response, I asked. Another pause. Shorter this time. The facility had no objections on record. I wrote that down too. I wrote it down in a certain way. In the flat declarative notation I use when I am recording something I do not yet understand but expect to understand later. In 22 years of diplomatic fieldwork, I have learned that the phrases which later matter most are the ones that seemed, at the time, like administrative formalities. No objections on record. I wrote it in full. I put a small mark beside it in the margin, the mark I use for things I want to return to. I should tell you something about the Solven calculus that the briefing documents do not include, because briefing documents are written by institutions, and institutions do not document their own blind spots. The calculus is not arrogant. Arrogance is an organic pathology, an overclaim of one's own capabilities relative to available evidence. The calculus does not overclaim. It processes evidence with a rigor that most species spend centuries trying to approximate and never quite reach. When the calculus tells you a probability, that probability is correct given the evidence they have. The problem is not the processing. Problem is always the inputs. 6 years of observation, 11 survey passes, continuous spectral monitoring at 48-hour intervals, a transponder that answered correctly every time, a power signature that matched the logged profile within acceptable variance, 41 crew members, or something producing biosignature readings consistent with 41 crew members, going about the business of a civilian waypoint facility. The calculus fed all of this into their model, and the model said 0.0031442%. The model was correct. Given those inputs, that probability was right. The question the calculus did not ask. The question I have thought about every day since. What would a non-civilian facility look like if it had been designed specifically to look like a civilian facility to a calculus observation array? The answer I now know is exactly like the Vandemark deep relay. I spent the 3 days before corridor entry reviewing the briefing materials in my quarters aboard the command node. The command node was a large vessel. Solven command architecture tends toward the spacious. Does the calculus prefer physical separation between processing nodes to reduce interference? And so the command deck and its subsidiary stations were spread across several hundred meters of hull, connected by wide, clean corridors that a crew of thousands use daily. I walked those corridors in the mornings. I ate in the small organic designated mess. I watched the transit formation on the nodes available to observers, which was most of them, because the calculus is not secretive about its transit operations. It has no reason to be. It goes where the model says it is safe to go, and the model is public. I read the Vandemark survey documentation 3 times. 11 passes over 6 years, each one logged with the ECA and cross-referenced with the calculus's own threat archive. The documentation was exquisitely detailed. The 3rd survey pass alone ran to 340 pages of spectral analysis, power signature decomposition, structural geometry modeling, and biosignature mapping. I am not a technical analyst, but I have learned, over a career in diplomatic intelligence assessment, how to read technical documentation for the shape of the argument rather than the content of the numbers. The shape of the Vandemark documentation was this: a facility that behaved the same way in every pass, at every frequency, under every scan modality, as a civilian relay station. Not similar to a civilian relay station. The same. The 6th survey pass, 18 months before the transit, included a note in the executive summary that I read carefully. It said, "No anomalies detected. Facility profile consistent with logged parameters across all observation modalities. Threat probability revised to 0.0314442%, unchanged from previous assessment." Unchanged from previous assessment. I turned that phrase in my mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling for the weight of it. A facility whose threat assessment had not moved in 11 dedicated survey passes. Most facilities, legitimate or otherwise, show some drift, operational changes, equipment updates, crew rotations, any of the 1,000 small variations that mark an active installation. The Vandemark deep relay had shown none. Its profile was not just consistent, it was static. 11 years of exactly the same electromagnetic fingerprint, variance so small that the calculus had flagged it as a model calibration success. I wrote a note in my log, remarkable consistency, query, operational variance analysis. I did not send that query to the calculus. I am a compliance observer, not a threat analyst. It was not my job to question the calculus's threat methodology. My job was to document the transit and file a report confirming that the corridor had been traversed according to ICA protocol. I closed my log and went to bed. I think about that note sometimes. We entered the corridor at 0600 standard on day 41 of the transit. The Vandemark station was visible on the long-range display. A compact, unassuming structure, the kind of boxy utility architecture that human engineers favor for deep space installations. No elegance, no wasted volume. A central hub with 4 radial arms, each arm terminating in a docking cluster. The whole thing running at the low, steady electromagnetic hum of a facility in routine operation. I had my own small display panel in the observation bubble. I was not supposed to adjust it. The liaison unit had been quite clear that my role was to observe, not to query. But the panel responded to touch, and I found that if I kept my queries polite and routine, the system answered them. I pulled up Calculus's real-time threat assessment overlay for the corridor. The Vandemark station had a blinking threat indicator. It was green. It had been green for 6 years. The transit echelon passed the outer marker buoys at 0614. The command node was approximately 60,000 kilometers from the Vandemark station by then, with the bulk of the cargo formation strung out behind us along the corridor's primary transit lane. The escort hulls were arranged in their standard formation, a layered envelope around the cargo column, the forward elements running about 20,000 kilometers ahead of the command node. I watched the station on my display as we closed the distance. At this range I could resolve it well enough to see individual structural elements, the 4 radial arms, the docking cluster terminations, the solar collections panels that supplemented the facility's power budget, twin communications arrays on the hub's upper surface. Everything in its correct place. Everything matching the survey documentation. At 0617, one of the solar collection panels was tracking slightly differently than the others. I noticed it the way you notice a detail that does not quite fit, but is too small to name yet. I watched it for 2 minutes. Tracking pattern was marginally non-standard. Not wrong, exactly, but pursuing a slightly different solar angle than the other panels. Put it down to minor mechanical drift and made a note in my log. I now know it was not drift. It was an antenna. At 0619, one of the calculus liaison units on the command deck. There were 3 of them present, managing the transit in that silent, distributed way of theirs, sharing data through tight beam links rather than speaking aloud. Made a small sound I had not heard from a Solven unit. 4. It was not speech, it was a processing noise. A brief, very rapid sequence of clicks, the kind a machine makes when its calculation queues overflow. A Solven liaison unit processes faster than any organic intelligence can follow, and in normal operations, the processing is seamless, invisible, its outputs appearing in speech or action with no audible intermediate. The clicks meant it was receiving data at a rate that exceeded the seamless threshold. Something had changed in the inputs, and the change was large. I looked at my display panel. The Vandemark station's threat indicator was still green. At 0621 it happened. There is a problem with describing it. Problem is that it happened in layers, and the layers arrived at different speeds, and by the time I understood the first layer, the third and fourth were already in motion. I will do my best to describe the layers in the order I perceive them, though they were not strictly sequential. The first thing I saw was light, not weapon fire, not an explosion. Light, a cold blue-white structural light that came from inside the Vandemark station's hull. Seams and gaps that had not been there before, or rather, from seams that had always been there but had always been dark. The station's 4 radial arms were not radial arms. I understood this in the first second. They were struts, load-bearing connectors. The docking clusters at their ends were not docking clusters. They were anchor points. What they were anchoring was becoming visible, because the outer hull of the station was moving. Not the whole hull at once, section by section, in a controlled sequence that was clearly not a structural failure. panels detaching, tumbling outward in clean separation lines. Kind of hull shedding you see when a designed system activates as intended. Each panel separating from its neighbors at defined points, tumbling away from the core at low velocity, clearing the volume around the structure's interior architecture. 11 years of zero-emission cold dock. 31 warhulls locked inside a superstructure that had been built around them, or built from them, both. I still do not know the precise engineering running on minimum life support and absolutely nothing else for 11 years. Zero active emissions. Zero registry. Zero variance from the profile of a civilian waypoint facility. Because the superstructure was the facility, and the facility was real. And the facility had a crew complement of 41, and those 41 people had been doing the genuine work of running a civilian relay station, while 31 warships sat cold and silent in the structure around them. The solar collection panels, all of them now, not just the one I had noticed, had gone dark and rotated flat against the hub, tracting. The communications arrays had folded inward. The civilian systems of the Vandemark deep relay were standing down in an orderly shutdown sequence, making room. The seam split. The calculus had 17 seconds between the first structural light and the first ignition. In 17 seconds, a Solven threat assessment node can run approximately 4,000 recalculation cycles. I know this from the post-event technical documentation that was eventually shared with the VETH Concordat as part of the formal inquiry. Calculus ran 3,847 cycles in those 17 seconds. In all 340 cycles, the output was the same. The inputs are corrupted. There is no model for this. This is the thing I keep returning to when I try to understand what happened. The calculus did not fail to respond because they were slow. They are not slow. They are the fastest threat assessment architecture that currently exists. They failed to respond because 3,847 recalculation cycles produced 3,847 identical outputs, and the output was not a threat probability, it was a flag, unknown category, no model available, run new baseline. Cannot respond to a threat, you cannot categorize. You cannot build a response matrix for an asset class that has no entry in your archive. The calculus ran new baseline. Building a new baseline from observed behavior data requires a minimum of 9 seconds of continuous observation of the new asset class. The new assets were not cooperating with 9 seconds of continuous anything. The station did not transform dramatically. That is another problem with descriptions. The dramatic transformation is what the imagination supplies, but the reality was much quieter. The outer hull simply fell away. In sections, deliberately. The sections were designed to detach cleanly, tumbling outward into the corridor's debris margins, and they did so without ceremony, without fire, without any of the things that mark a moment as historic. Panels of boxy utility architecture rotating slowly away from a core that was no longer a waypoint facility. What was left was not a station, it was a spine. A central weapon spine, 1,100 meters from stem to stern, 31 hard points. I counted them later, from the telemetry, when I had time to count things, and along those hard points, the cold-docked warhulls were waking up. Not all at once, in sequence. This is important, and I did not understand its importance until I had time to think. The calculus, running its 3,847 recalculation cycles, was looking for a predictive model. A simultaneous ignition of all 31 hulls would have given the calculus a complete picture immediately. 31 assets, known positions, known vectors the moment they departed the spine. A Solven threat assessment node can build a response matrix for 31 known assets in approximately 9 seconds. They ignited in sequence. Over 4 minutes and 12 seconds, one hull every 8 seconds, each one departing the spine on a different vector. Each one at a different acceleration profile, each departure reshaping the threat model the calculus was trying to build. Every time a Solven node completed a partial model, a new hull ignited and the model was incomplete again. By the time the last hull was running free, the calculus had 31 separate tracks, 31 separate recalculation queues, and not one completed response matrix. They had accounted for the calculus's recalculation architecture. They had planned for exactly how long it would take a Solven node to build a response matrix for a known asset, and they had staggered the deployment timing. to ensure the matrix would never be complete. Someone had sat with a technical specification of Solven threat assessment architecture and worked backward from the response time and built a deployment sequence that specifically broke it. That is not a plan made in haste. That is a plan made with time to think and the patience to trust that thinking without modification for 11 years. I am telling you this as though I understood it at the time. I did not. At the time I was watching the light. The central spine, the weapon spine, the thing the station had been concealing, was firing. I don't have good language for what the weapons were. The Veth Concordat's technical vocabulary was not built for this. The closest I can get is distributed axis accelerators, very long baseline, firing coordinated sequences along the spine's primary axis. The effect was that the forward escort elements of the calculus transit echelon, the 400 hull envelope that had been running 20,000 kilometers ahead of the command node, encountered fire from a source that was not the war hulls. The war hulls were doing something else. The spine was doing this. The distinction mattered. 31 war hulls in the escort envelope were a response problem for the escort elements. A threat that the escorts could orient toward, fire solutions that the escorts could attempt to build, even without a complete model. The spine was a different problem. It was firing from a fixed position, but its firing arcs covered the full angular diameter of the column, and it was not trying to destroy individual hulls. It was firing patterns, interlocking geometries of fire that swept volumes of the cargo column in overlapping sequences, each sweep clearing a zone and moving on, each successive sweep arriving before the preceding zone's contents had dispersed. This is not a technique I was equipped to recognize in the moment. I recognized it later, from the technical documentation, as a method designed for exactly this scenario, a high-density formation in a constrained corridor, where individual targeting is inefficient and volumetric clearance is faster. At 0623, the calculus liaison units on the command deck had stopped making sounds entirely. This was more frightening than the clicks. The clicks meant they were processing at overflow. The silence meant something had changed in the processing. And I did not know what. Later I would learn that Solven command units, when they determine that the current model is irrecoverably compromised, shift all available processing to a single function, the construction of a new model from scratch. They go quiet because they are no longer managing the existing situation. They have abandoned the current model. They are starting over, and starting over requires everything they have. They did not have time to finish the new model. The first of the 31 war hulls reached the forward escort envelope at 0624. I tracked it on my display. It was not a large hull, not what I had expected, knowing it had been cold docked inside a space station superstructure for 11 years. 400 meters. Perhaps less. Narrow, the kind of profile that does not look threatening until you understand what it means for. Something that sized to be moving at the speed it was moving. The speed was the thing. Corridor transit doctrine is built around approach velocities that allow response windows. This hull was not moving at a corridor transit velocity. It was moving at a velocity that closed the response window to approximately 2 seconds at the point of contact with the escort elements. 2 seconds is an eternity for a calculus fire control system. 2 seconds with a completed threat model and a loaded targeting solution. 2 seconds with no model and no solution is nothing at all. The escort elements had targeting solutions. Of course they did. The calculus always has targeting solutions. But a targeting solution is a prediction, and a prediction is built on a model, and the model was not finished. 14 escort hulls fired on the first war hull. 14 targeting solutions, representing the best threat response capability in the calculus's transit escort doctrine. The fire was simultaneous, coordinated, the kind of combined response that the calculus's transit escort architecture was specifically designed to produce in exactly this scenario. A single high-velocity inbound contact on the envelope perimeter. The war hull did not stop. I need to be careful here about what I say, because the technical details of what happened to those 14 targeting solutions are still under formal inquiry, and I am not a weapons analyst. What I can say is what I observed. The war hull continued on its vector, and the 14 escort hulls that had fired were no longer on the display. Not destroyed in the dramatic sense, not as explosions visible at my display resolution, simply absent. Their contact markers, which had been there, dark. Not gradually, at once. And in the space where they had been, the warhull continued, reducing velocity now, taking a new vector through the interior of the escort envelope. 14 hulls, in 2 seconds. I checked the display 3 times in the following seconds because I thought it was a sensor artifact. It was not a sensor artifact. The second warhull entered the envelope at 06248, the third at 06241, the fourth at 06224. They were arriving every 8 seconds, which is the same interval at which they had ignited from the spine, and this made sense to me later, but made no sense to me then. I was watching the display and trying to count contacts and losing count because the display was changing too fast. Each new hull arriving took a different entry vector, engaging a different section of the escort envelope, and the escort elements were attempting to respond to each one in turn, attempting to build individual response matrices for contacts that were moving in ways that deviated from every archived velocity profile, and the response matrices were not completing before the next hull arrived. At 626, the calculus command node began an emergency reorientation. I felt it. The inertial compensation system absorbing the first phase of a turn, the slight press of acceleration against my seat. That means a vessel is doing something it was not doing before. The observation bubble, on the port flank, swept through its arc as the command node turned broadside to the transit lane. Through the viewport I had a brief, unobstructed view down the corridor. What I saw was the cargo column. 8,000 hulls, 43 kilometers long, a density of formation that represents one of the most impressive feats of navigational coordination in the quadrant. The Solven calculus moves cargo the way most species move armies, with a precision that can only come from absolute certainty about every variable. 43 kilometers of perfect spacing, perfect vector alignment, perfect velocity management. PERC. It had been one of the genuinely beautiful things I had seen on this transit, the kind of organized scale that produces an aesthetic response even in a diplomatic observer whose job is to stay neutral. The weapons was firing down that column. I watched it fire. The sweeping geometric patterns I had not yet understood were visible as coherent lines of effect through the formation, each line arriving, completing its sweep, departing, the next line already in motion before the first had finished. The column was not a column anymore, along the sections where the sweeps had passed. It was debris and drifting hulls in the negative space where hulls had been. I looked away. This is in my notes. I looked away for 11 seconds, and then I looked back, because I was there to document, and documentation requires looking. The reorientation completed at 0629. We were broadside to the corridor now, and no longer running the transit lane. The display told me we had drifted approximately 20,000 kilometers from our 061 position, partly from the deliberate reorientation, partly from the emergency thruster burst that had preceded it. The calculus does not panic. What it does when a model fails is move its most critical assets to a position from which new observations is possible. The command node was its most critical asset in the echelon, and it had moved. At 0628, the liaison unit nearest to me spoke. It was the first time any of them had spoken since 0621. Transit echelon integrity is at 61%, it said. Its voice had changed. Not much. Solven voices do not have much range, but the cadence was different, slower. The way a metronome sounds when the mechanism is running down. I said nothing. I was doing arithmetic. 61% integrity from 11,200 hulls. That left 39% unaccounted. 39% of 11,200 is 4,368 hulls in 7 minutes. The other 30 warhulls were inside the envelope by 0627. I had tracked them as best I could on the display. The calculus escort formation had lost its geometric cohesion by 0625. The layered envelope that had been its strength was now its weakness, because the 31 warhulls were inside it, not outside it. And the calculus's close-range fire control doctrine is built for threats approaching from outside the envelope, not threats distributed through its interior. The escort hulls were attempting to respond without fratricide, without firing on their own formation. And fratricide avoidance requires, again, completed model. The model was not finished. The spine was still firing. At SO 631, I became aware of something that is difficult to convey in documentation, but that I want to convey because I think it matters. The display in my observation bubble was a civilian-grade interface, not a tactical system. It had been given to me for general situational awareness, close analysis of a combat engagement. It showed me contacts, hull tracks, emission signatures, general positional data, but it did not show me firing solutions or damage assessments, or the kind of tactical overlay that would have let me understand in real time what I was looking at. What it showed me instead was the aggregate, the shape of the whole thing, and the shape was this. The 31 warhols were moving through the escort envelope, in a pattern, not randomly, not in the reactive, responsive way that combatants usually move, where the movement is a continuous adjustment to the threat, each decision a reply to the last thing the enemy did. They were moving in a pattern that had been decided in advance, a geometric choreography that each hull was executing independently without visible coordination, as though the coordination had already happened, somewhere else, sometime before, and what I was watching was the output of that prior coordination playing out across a space of several thousand kilometers. That is when I understood, I think. That is when the shape of the 11 years came into focus. Not in the moment of the hull panels falling, not in the first ignition, not even in the withdrawal of the 4 panel sections that had been the radial arms. In the movement pattern. Because the movement pattern told me something the panel fall had not. They had planned for this specific formation, this specific corridor, this specific echelon configuration. They had known or determined or calculated that the third transit echelon would move through corridor nuzzle 7 in this formation, with this escort geometry, and they had built the deployment sequence and the movement pattern to dismantle that geometry. Which means the planning had happened recently. The 6 years of concealment predated the planning, but the specific plan had been built against the specific threat, which means someone had been watching the calculus's transit scheduling and had taken the transit notification, the one the station had acknowledged with no objections, and had used the information in it, transit formation, estimated entry time, standard escort geometry for a formation of this type and size. The calculus had sent them the inputs for their own model. At 0633, the command node's senior liaison unit addressed the corridor-wide communications band. Solven command units do not typically use corridor-wide broadcast. It is imprecise, scattershot, the communications equivalent of shouting, and the calculus does not shout. This one did. This is Calculus Command Node 7 Saren. We are requesting immediate engagement cessation under Corridor Transit Protocol 7 article. The weapon's spine's firing pattern changed. It had been firing along the primary axis. Down the cargo column the long direction, it shifted. The new firing axis was perpendicular to the column, a sweeping traversal, and the pattern was not random. I understood immediately. It was systematic, a clearance pattern. The kind of pattern that a weapons system runs when it is ensuring that a defined volume of space is free of specific contacts. The senior liaison unit did not finish the article citation. At 0634, the display's echelon integrity readout updated. 38%. 10 minutes since the spine had first fired. I did the arithmetic again. 62% of 11,200 hulls. In 13 minutes, 6,944 hulls. I sat with that number for a moment. I am not going to dress up what I felt. I was sitting a sealed observation bubble on a vessel, surrounded by the wreckage of a formation I had been traveling inside for 41 days, and the number on the display was large, and I was afraid. But underneath the fear there was something else, something more uncomfortable, which was that I was not surprised, not entirely. The small mark I had put in my log beside no objections on record had been waiting for me to turn to it, and I was returning to it now, and the return felt like recognition rather than revelation. They had not objected because they had not needed to. At 0634, I watched the command deck's 3 liaison units enter a state I had not witnessed in 4 years of working alongside calculus personnel. They were not silent, and they were not processing at the overflow click threshold. They were doing something in between. A very low, sustained harmonic that I felt more than heard, a vibration in the command deck's composite plating that I initially attributed to the emergency power systems, and then realized 2 minutes of it was emanating from the liaison units themselves. I asked quietly whether there was anything I should do. The nearest unit said, without turning, "You should remain in the observation bubble." "I am in the observation bubble," I said. "Yes," it said, and then the harmonic resumed. I learned later from the inquiry documentation that what I was hearing was a distributed processing state unique to Solven command tier units operating under conditions of sustained model failure. A normal calculus processing engagement produces no audible byproduct. The processing is clean, fast, resolved. When a model cannot be resolved, processing load does not simply stop. It redistributes. The 3 command tier units had linked their processing architectures and were running a shared baseline reconstruction, and the harmonic was the interference pattern produced by 3 Solven processing cores running in close proximity on the same unresolved problem. The inquiry documentation described it as elevated collective processing signature. The liaison unit who described it to me in person used a word I had not heard a Solven unit use before. The translation approximates to strain. The calculus does not have a word for distress. It has a word for strain, which is what happens when a system is processing at maximum capacity against a problem it cannot solve, and the processing is beginning to affect other functions. That is what I was hearing. 3 Solven command tier units strained, running a model that would not finish, while the engagement continued without them. At 0636, 2 of the 31 Warhol tracks on my display converged briefly at a section of the escort formation that had partially reorganized. The escort elements that had managed to rebuild something like a coherent subformation after the initial penetration. I watched the convergence. The reconstituted subformation had, by my count, something between 300 and 400 hulls in it. The 2 Warhols arrived at its perimeter from opposing vectors. Flanking approach, coordinated timing, and the subformation's response was to orient toward one of them, which was the correct doctrine for a contact from that vector, which meant its response to the second hull was delayed by approximately the same 2 seconds that had characterized every previous engagement in the last 15 minutes. 2 seconds again. The same 2 seconds replaying because the pattern was the same. The response architecture required a completed model, and the model could not be completed in 2 seconds. And the hulls knew this and moved accordingly. The subformation went dark on my display. At 0637, the command node's power systems shifted. I felt it. A change in the vibration through the deck that I recognized from emergency drills as the profile of a vessel transitioning from standard power to emergency-only power. The observation bubble sealed. A secondary atmospheric membrane came down across the viewport, and I lost the direct visual on the corridor. I was looking at the display only. The display told me, transit echelon integrity, 28%. The command node was intact. I was intact. Some portion of the echelon was intact. The calculus liaison units were silent again. Whatever model they were building it in the quiet that their architecture requires. And there was nothing for me to do but watch the display and note the time and try to understand what I was looking at. What I was looking at was this: a species that had built a civilian relay station that was also 31 warships and a weapons spine, and had run it as a civilian relay station for 11 years, and had received a transit notification from the most capable threat modeling organization in the quadrant, and had not objected and had waited. And the waiting was not passive. This is important. I have seen passive waiting, the dormant systems, the sealed archives, the cold storage facilities that represent a capability in reserve. The Vandemark station was not passive. Its concealment was active. 41 people for 11 years, actively running a civilian relay station, processing legitimate cargo notifications, responding to legitimate distress calls along the Null 7 reach, filing legitimate maintenance reports with the ICA, doing the real work of a real facility because the facility was real, using the realness of the facility as the concealment. The 41 crew were not pretending to run a relay station. They were running one. The concealment was not a disguise worn over inactivity. It was activity. I am a diplomat. I have spent my career in the spaces between species, formal rituals of notification and acknowledgement, and recorded objection, and official protest, and escalating demarche. I know how those spaces work, because I know that every species that has achieved interstellar capability has, at some point, learned that the spaces between conflict and peace are maintained by communication, and that the most important communications are often the ones you don't send. The Vandemark station had not sent an objection because an objection was a communication, and a communication would have changed the inputs, and changed inputs would have changed the model, and a changed model might have changed the transit decision, and a changed transit decision would have meant 11,200 calculus hulls were not in corridor null 7 on day 41. They had let the model stay wrong. For 6 years they had fed the observation array exactly the inputs it was looking for, and when the notification came, they had acknowledged it with the one response that would not alter a single variable in the calculus's threat assessment. No objections on record. At 0639, I became aware that the command node was no longer maneuvering. The vibration had settled into the flat, steady hum of a vessel in station-keeping mode. I checked the display. We were approximately 80 kilometers from our 0619 position. We had drifted and been pushed in the chaos of the reorientation and the emergency power shift, and the corridor around us looked different in a way that I want to describe accurately. It did not look like a battlefield in any sense I recognized. There was no fire, no large debris clouds. The Solven hulls that had been the echelon were not, most of them, visibly destroyed. They were simply absent from the display's active contact list. Some were in the secondary overlay as drift contacts. Hulls moving on ballistic trajectories, no active drive signature, which means either disabled or abandoned. The vast majority were not on the display at all. I do not know what that means technically. I know what it meant in terms of the number I had been doing arithmetic on, and I know that the arithmetic produced a result I will not specify here, because I don't think the number, by itself, communicates what the display communicated, which was the shape of the former formation, and the absence of it, and the corridor that remained. The corridor was open. It was visible on the display as a navigable lane with no significant contact density. The Vandemark station was in the middle of it. The 31 warhulls were converging on the station from their dispersal positions in the former formation's debris margins, converging inward, toward the spine, in the same 8-second sequence that had characterized their deployment. They were coming back. At 0641, the command node received a signal. The liaison unit closest to me processed it, and then did something I had not seen a Solven unit do in 4 years of diplomatic work. It turned toward me. Not because it needed to look at me. Solven units do not require line of sight for communication. Because the act of turning was, I realized, the closest a calculus liaison unit comes to an involuntary gesture. It had processed the signal, and the processing had produced something it did not know what to do with, and it turned toward the nearest organic intelligence as though hoping I might be able to explain. I could not explain, but I could read the signal summary it was pushing to my display panel. Tight beam, aimed at the command node specifically, originating from the Vandemark station's central hub. Short, 4 lines. The first line was, "This corridor remains open to civilian traffic under standard ICA protocols." The second line was, "Veth Concordat Envoy Analyst or Vein Null, safe passage is confirmed." The third line was, "The third transit echelon is advised that the above does not extend to military formations." Fourth line was, "The Vandemark Deep Relay regrets any inconvenience." I read this 3 times. The liaison unit was still turned toward me. I was aware that whatever I said in the next few seconds would appear, verbatim, in my compliance report, and that my compliance report would be read by the full Veth Concordat Policy Council, and that the Policy Council would read it in the context of whatever the calculus was filing in their own incident documentation, and that the diplomatic implications of what I said and did not say in the next 36 hours were going to require every skill I had accumulated in 22 years of interstellar diplomatic service. I spent a moment on the fourth line. The Vandemark Deep Relay regrets any inconvenience. In diplomatic correspondence, the expression of regret is a precise instrument. It is not an apology. An apology acknowledges wrongdoing. Regret acknowledges consequence. We regret any inconvenience is a construction that says, something happened. We are aware it affected you. We are not acknowledging that it should not have happened. Every diplomatic institution in the quadrant uses it. I have used it myself, in notes verbales to 3 different species, in contexts where I needed to acknowledge an outcome without conceding a position. It was the correct formula for this situation. I found I could not decide whether this made it more or less remarkable, that whoever had drafted the tight beam had known the correct diplomatic formula, that they had reached for it without apparent difficulty, that the 4th line was not a boast or a warning or a threat, but exactly the register appropriate for a facility that had done what it needed to do, and was returning to normal operations, inconvenience. For 8,147 hulls and the model that had sent them, I said, please note in the incident record that the Vandemark facility has offered SAFPAFETH Concordat personnel and has confirmed the corridor's civilian traffic status. The liaison unit processed this for 0.2 seconds. Noted, it said. At ERO 64130, the weapon's spine powered down. Saw it on the display. The energy signature dropped cleanly to standby levels, and then below standby, and then to the low steady hum I recognized from every observation pass in the briefing documentation. The civilian waypoint facility power profile. The same one that had been in the archive for 11 years. The same one that had produced 0.00314442%. The 31 war hulls were still tracking on the display. They had not returned to the spine yet. They were running the outward dispersal pattern. The clearance sweep through the debris field that had been the cargo column, and I watched them do this in the same organized, unhurried way they had done everything else since 0621. Not aggressive, not searching, methodical. The same quality the spine's firing had. The quality of a system executing a plan rather than responding to events, because the events had been anticipated, and the plan had been built around the anticipated events, and the system was simply following the plan. Another 6 minutes, I watched in silence. At 0647, the last war hull completed its dispersal run and turned. A long, slow turn, unhurried, the kind of maneuver a vessel makes when it is not evading anything and has no reason to hurry. It came back along the corridor toward the spine. The other 30 were already there, or close to it, taking up approach vectors on the spine's hard points. I watched them dock, one by one, the same sequence as the ignition, one every 8 seconds, each one settling into its hard point and going cold, power signatures dropping as they locked back into dock status. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The same time it had taken to deploy them. At 065112, the last war hull docked and went cold. The spine's structural lights dimmed. I watched the debris panels that had been the station's outer hull, the boxy utility architecture panels, the load-bearing arm sections, the solar collection panels, the communications arrays, and their housing mounts, all the cosmetic and functional components of a civilian waypoint facility. As they continued their slow drift at the corridor margins, there was no way to reattach them. The concealment was gone, but the station was still there. The spine was still there. 31 hardpoints were full again, and the power's signature was already settling back toward the logged profile, the same profile. Without the outer hull, the thermal and electromagnetic character was different, but settling. The facility's systems coming back online in their standard sequence. Life support, communications relay, long-range sensors, ICA transponder. Transponder response, when it came back, was the correct code. The crew complement reading was 41. It did not look like a civilian facility anymore. The spine was visible, the hardpoints were visible, the warhull cradles were plainly structural features of a military installation. But it was operational, and the corridor was open, and the tight beam had been clear. Civilian traffic, standard protocols. I sat in the sealed observation bubble for a total of 22 minutes before I began drafting my compliance report. During those 22 minutes, I did several things. I reviewed my notes. I checked the display for changes in the station status, of which there were none. I looked at the corridor on the display and tried to hold its current state and its 0600 state in my mind simultaneously. Not. I considered the tight beam message, all 4 lines of it, and in particular the 4th line, and found that I did not know how to process the 4th line, and so set it aside for the formal report. I thought about a conversation I had had, 6 months before the transit, with a colleague at the Concordat's Null 7 regional desk. The conversation had been about the transit notification, specifically, whether the Veth Concordat should formally object to the calculus. Routing a formation of this size through a corridor that passed through human, controlled space. My colleague had said that formal objection was unnecessary because the calculus had already assessed the corridor as safe, and objecting to a formation moving through a safe corridor would be a diplomatic overreach. I had agreed. I had said, if the humans object, that's their affair. I thought about that for a while. I thought about the 41 people who had spent 11 years making the facility real, enough to sustain the concealment. I thought about what it cost a person to do that, not operationally, in the private sense of cost that has no entry in any threat model. Whether they had known, when they signed on for it, how long it would be. Whether they had known it would come to this, in this corridor, against this formation. At ZO 701, the senior liaison unit spoke again. Its voice had returned to its normal cadence. The flat metronomic certainty of an entity that has processed its data and reached its conclusions. Whatever it had found in the new model, it had integrated it. That is the thing about the calculus. They do not stay surprised. They update. The new model would be different from the old one, and the new probability would be different from 0.0031442%. And the calculus would act on the new probability as precisely as it had acted on the old one, because that is the only way the calculus knows how to act. Envoy analyst Orvain Null, it said. The Veth Concordat has been offered safe passage. We are prepared to facilitate your transfer to a Concordat-registered vessel at your convenience. I thanked it. I noted the time. I began drafting my compliance report. The report took me 11 days to write, which is not unusual for a complex incident. I rewrote the summary section 4 times. The difficulty was the same difficulty I had in the observation bubble, the problem of 2 images that cannot be held in the mind simultaneously. A civilian relay station that responded correctly to every query for 6 years. 31 warholes that had never been in any archive. I kept trying to describe them as the same thing because they were the same thing. The station and the concealment and the capability were not separate. They were one system, one decision, one 11-year act of collective patience, and every draft that separated them into categories got the description wrong. The final report noted the following, in formal language that I will here render in something approximating plain speech, that the Vandemark Deep Relay had operated as a legitimate civilian waypoint facility throughout the observation period, that its recorded power profile, crew complement, and transponder responses had been accurate within ICA standards, that the concealed capability represented by the weapon's spine and associated warholes had not, in the strict technical sense, violated any interstellar commerce protocol, since no protocol addresses the concealment of military assets within a nominally civilian structure, because no such protocol had previously been necessary, that the corridor had been reopened to civilian traffic under standard protocols as stated, and that the 3rd transit echelon had entered the corridor on the basis of a threat assessment that was correct, given the available inputs. On page 37 of the report, in the section titled Observations and Recommendations, I wrote a single paragraph that took me 3 days to draft, and that I have been told has since been reprinted in 4 separate treaty negotiation things across the quadrant, though I cannot confirm this. It read, the Vandemark engagement does not represent a failure of the Solven calculus's threat assessment methodology. The methodology functioned correctly. The calculus assigned a probability consistent with 6 years of observation data, and that probability was accurate relative to the inputs provided. The engagement represents, rather, a category of strategic behavior for which current threat assessment doctrine across all quadrant signatories has no established model, a species that is chosen, deliberately and systematically, not to demonstrate its actual military capability in any observable context, as long as it takes, until demonstration becomes necessary. This office has no record of any prior engagement with a species that operates on this doctrinal basis. This office recommends that all signatories treat the absence of observable military capability as a data point requiring explanation rather than as confirmation of civilian status. I filed the report and took 2 months leave. The Vandemark station is still there. Checked the ICA registry before I sat down to write this account, which is not an official report but a personal document that I am composing because I find I need to. The registry shows a waypoint facility in Corridor 07, crew complement, 41, power profile, within normal variance for a facility of stated purpose, transponder status, active, no outer hull listed. The panels are still drifting at the corridor margins, and the IC registry note for the facility reads, structural modification, cosmetic, non-operational impact, review pending, 11 months since the engagement. Civilian traffic has been transiting the corridor without incident since it reopened 2 days after the engagement. The facility has been responding to all standard IC query correctly. Last month, the IC conducted a routine survey pass. The facility responded to the survey probe with the correct transponder codes. I have been asked in the inquiry and several times since whether the Vandemark facility's actions were proportionate. This is a diplomatic question, and it deserves a diplomatic answer, is that proportionality is assessed relative to the triggering event, and the triggering event was the routing of a military transit formation of 200 hulls through a corridor that contained a concealed human installation without the installation's consent, and the assessment of proportionality on that basis is above my authority, and will require several years of treaty negotiation to resolve. I have not checked the calculus's current threat probability for the Vandemark station. I do not think I want to know what number they have assigned to it now. I suspect it is much larger than 0.0031442%. I also suspect, and this is the part I think about when I cannot sleep, that the new probability, however large it is still built on an incomplete model, because the new model is built on the engagement data. 31 hulls, 1 weapon spine, 1 corridor, 11 minutes and 40 seconds, 847 calculus hulls that did not exit the corridor, and the question the calculus has to answer, building that new model, is the same question they did not ask the first time. What would a species look like if it had built many more of these and was still waiting, not dormant, active, running legitimate civilian facilities, responding to queries, filing correct maintenance reports, waiting not passively, but as a sustained act of collective will across years, across dozens of installations, each one real, each one a waypoint facility with 41 crew members, going about the genuine work of operating a deep space relay, and also something else, docked cold inside the structure, with a plan encoded before the docking and a deployment sequence, built against the most likely threat model, and a patience that does not require reassurance or maintenance, or any external input to sustain itself. The calculus will build a new threat probability for Corridor 07. I do not think they will route another formation through it. I do not know what I think they will do about the other corridors. What I know is this. The Vandemark station's power profile is normal. Its transponder is active. Its crew complement is 41. It is running by every observable metric as a civilian waypoint facility. It said nothing for 6 years. It is saying nothing now.